Before we get started, this is an introduction to a series of history videos that will be listed under as the Banana Wars. Now, this video is simply acting as a bit of a background of the United Fruits Company, a US company that essentially caused a massive amount of issues within Central America for over a century, and they had a massive hand in causing the Banana Wars. This video will cover the company's history up until the 1930s and the adoption of the US's Good Neighbor policy. There was a massive amount of horrible events and information that this company has done following that time frame, but that will not be the scope of this video. Just want to get that out of the way before continuing on. In 1871, US entrepreneur Henry Meigs signed a contract with the government of Costa Rica to build a railroad connecting the capital of San Jose to the port of Limon. Meigs was assisted in the project by his nephew, Minor C. Keith, who took over Meigs' business in Costa Rica after his death in 1877. Keith from there began experimenting with the planting of bananas as a cheap source of food for his workers. When the Costa Rican government defaulted on its payments in 1882, Keith had to borrow £1.2 million to continue the engineering project. In exchange for this, and for renegotiating Costa Rica's own debt, the administration of President Prospero Oramuno agreed to give Keith 800,000 acres of land along the railway, plus a 99-year lease on the train route. The railroad was complete in 1890, but the flow of passengers proved insufficient to offset the debt. On the other hand, the sale of bananas grown in his lands and transported first by train to Limon, then by ship to the United States, proved to be very lucrative. Keith eventually came to dominate the banana trade in Central America and along the Caribbean coast of Colombia. In 1899, Keith lost $1.5 million when a New York City broker went bankrupt. He traveled to Boston to participate in the merger of his trading company, the Tropical Trading and Transport, with the rival Boston Fruit Company. Boston Fruit had been established by Lorenzo Dow Baker, a sailor who, in 1870, had bought his first bananas in Jamaica, and with businessman Andrew Preston. The merger formed the United Fruits Company based in Boston, with Preston as president and Keith as vice president. Preston's lawyer Bradley Palmer became a permanent member of the executive committee, and for long periods of time acted as the director. Together, these men had a massive influence over the market, with Preston bringing his plantations from the West Indies, a fleet of steamships, and his market in the US Northeast. Keith brought his plantations and railroads in Central America, with his market in the US South and Southeast. The company, at Palmer's direction, proceeded to buy or buy a share in 14 different competitors, assuring them 80% of the banana import business into the United States, then their main source of income. The company catapulted into financial success following this, with Bradley Palmer overnight becoming a much sought-after expert in business law, as well as a very wealthy man. He later became a consultant to presidents and an advisor to Congress. The company would often bribe the Central American governments for special treatment, and they had ingrown monopolies on transportation, communication, and land ownership in these nations. Various economic exclaves existed, where the company's investment only helped itself and its investors, while providing little to no of the way of the export wealth to the host country. One of the company's primary tactics for maintaining market dominance was to control the distribution of lands. The company claimed that hurricanes and other natural threats required them to hold extra land or reserve land that wasn't owned by them. In practice, what this meant was that the fruits company was able to prevent the government from distributing banana lands or other crop lands to peasants who wanted a share of the trade. The fact that the company relied so heavily on manipulating land rights uses had a number of long-term consequences for the region. For the company to maintain its unequal land holdings, it often required government concessions, and this in turn meant that the company had to be politically involved in the region even though it was an American company, and the term Banana Republic comes directly from this. This resulted in a massive amount of public unrest in these nations, and the United States on more than one occasion had invaded, occupied, policed, or overthrew the nation's government to install a pro-American, pro-United Fruits government and/or dictator, all in the name of profit. Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 1 of the Short Banana Wars series. The Banana Wars were a series of US invasion/interventions in Latin America during the early 20th century. This series is meant to give a little insight as to what occurred during these events that in many ways have impacted the citizens of these nations until modern day. In today's episode, we'll be looking at the Santo Domingo Affair. The Santo Domingo Affair refers to an incident in 1904 between the US and the Dominican Republic. It occurred following the death of a seaman on February the 1st, and the US military launched a punitive invasion which routed the Dominican forces. Revolution in Central America was widespread during the Banana Wars era. In response to perceived American interests, the US Navy regularly patrolled all over Central America. Rebels in the city of Santo Domingo had previously fired on 2 American merchant ships and damaged property at the American-owned sugar plantations. Marines from the USS Detroit had been landed in November of 1903, but they were withdrawn when the situation appeared stable. On February the 1st the following year, the auxiliary cruiser the USS Yankee was on patrol off of Santo Domingo. The American captain decided to send some men ashore to make contact with the Dominicans, but when the boat was away from the Yankee, a group of men attacked it with small arms fire. In response, President Theodore Roosevelt ordered 2 more cruisers to the islands to exact an apology, and these cruisers were under the command of Captain Richard Wainwright. Wainwright arrived at San Domingo on February the 10th. The following day, he sent a boat from his ship flying the American flag, which was sent towards the dock, as they were escorting crew intending to offload cargo. As they did so, the rebels opened fire with their small arms. Several shots hit the steamer, and a few grazed the naval launch, but there were no casualties. Wainwright, having informed his superiors and gotten their approval, launched an amphibious assault and naval bombardment. The USS Newark opened fire with her broadside at 3:25 p.m., while the Columbia covered the landing. 10 minutes later, the bombardment ceased, and 375 Americans headed to the beach. The landing party was under the direct command of Lieutenant Commander James P. Parker. At least 100 Dominicans were using the old Fort Ozama as a base. The Americans received some rifle fire while still on the water, and when they landed at 4:30, they attacked and routed the rebels, with only 1 American being hurt in the engagement, when he accidentally fired his revolver into his foot. Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 2 of the Short Banana Wars series. The Banana Wars were a series of US invasions/interventions in Latin America during the early 20th century. This series is meant to give a little insight as to what occurred during these events that in many ways have impacted the citizens of these nations until modern day. In today's episode, we'll be looking at the 3 US interventions into Cuba. The second US occupation of Cuba, the first being during the Spanish-American War, occurred following the 1905 elections in the island, with conservative Ezrada Palma and his party rigging the election to ensure victory over the liberal candidate Jose Miguel Gomez. Following the obvious rig, the Liberal Party and supporters orchestrated a revolt in August the following year, with both sides trying to garner support from the United States. Roosevelt sent Secretary of War William Howard Taft to negotiate. However, when Ezrada Palma recognized that Roosevelt was not prepared to support his position, he resigned on September the 28th of 1906. The day following his resignation, Secretary Taft invoked the terms of the 1903 treaty, which essentially stated that the United States had the right to intervene in Cuba if governmental unrest occurred. Taft established the Provisional Government of Cuba and named himself Provisional Governor. The US landed a brigade of Marines under the command of Colonel Littleton Waller. They were there to protect American citizens and patrol the island until the regular army arrived. The rebels offered no resistance and viewed the American intervention as a sign of success. so much so that most of them surrendered before the regular army units arrived. 1 month later, around 7,000 regular army men arrived on the island. With the rebellion already suppressed essentially, the army didn't have a need for its regular occupational duties, and so instead, they focused on building roads and outposts. A total of 92 kilometers of new roads were constructed during the occupation, and the army manned about 30 different posts in both the rural and urban areas. They also focused on guarding areas that are vital for sugarcane exportation, being the main economic base for the nation, as well as building an intelligence outfit to garner information about Cuban military capabilities and to keep a record of all individuals that took part in the 1906 revolt. Regional elections took place on May the 25th of 1908, and the presidential election on November the 14th, both supervised by the US military. The elections took place without incident, and Jose Miguel Gomez was elected. He took office on January the 28th of 1909. The US troops were withdrawn over the following weeks, with the last American forces leaving the island on February the 6th. This wasn't the end for Gomez though. Conditions in Cuba were poor for the black inhabitants, most of them who were employed in the sugarcane industry. Evaristo Estenos led a movement to better these conditions, which had begun in 1895 during the War for Independence from Spain. Veterans of that war organized the Independent Party of Color in 1908. The party quickly gained support of the large number of Afro-Cubans in opposition to Gomez. Gomez ordered the party disbanded as a law was on the books, which outlawed political parties based on race. On May the 20th, Estenos and his men confronted the Cuban army. Fighting took place mainly in Oriente province, where most African Cubans lived. Initially, the rebels were successful against the Cuban forces, and with this, President Gomez requested aid from the US President William Howard Taft, who sent additional Marines to the island. Eventually, US forces numbered some 3,000, yet again with the goal of protecting the sugar plantation owners, as well as occupying and patrolling various towns. Estenos and his rebellion started to evaporate at this point, and he himself was killed on June the 27th of 1909. This wasn't the last intervention though. Following the 1916 Cuban elections, it was once again called into question when President Mario Garcia Monacal was re-elected on suspicion of election fraud. Once again, forces rose up against the Cuban government. However, the rebellion lacked the military might to fully match the Cubans head-to-head, helped heavily by the training that the Cuban military had gotten from the Americans a decade prior. The US landed troops again in the effort to quote-unquote protect American sugar farms. The rebel leaders, seeing that no US support was coming, largely concluded peace with the government. Many of them were forced to emigrate, but amnesty was given to all that had partook. It didn't solve the problem, however, as many rebel groups, especially in eastern Cuba, were unaware of such a peace agreement, and the massively scattered bands were left on their own without any central command, and the government had no capability to deal with them. At the same time, the support for the insurgency broadened, due to the concentration of agriculture in big, privately owned plots of land specializing on sugar. The peasants were basically becoming bankrupt. The US, seeing this, eventually ordered troops to be stationed within the island once again, as a way to stop any German influence over the rebellion, and to ensure that the sugar harvest was not interrupted. During the first year of arrival, the US Marines helped build infrastructure related to sugar plantations. In October of 1916, they established a number of permanent camps all around the island. Already in November, the presence of the troops caused anti-American protests, and these protests led to another 1,000 Marines arriving the following month. The troops performed patrols of the countryside to ensure that sugar plantations were safe. In addition, they collected intelligence, tried to obtain general information, and pass it to the United States, as well as to the authorities in Havana. Following this, the unrest in the East largely subsided, and the US would have permanent patrols in Cuba until the adoption of the Good Neighbor policy in 1934. Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 3 of the Short Banana Wars series. The Banana Wars were a series of US invasions/interventions in Latin America during the early 20th century. This series is meant to give a little insight as to what occurred during these events that in many ways have impacted the citizens of these nations until modern day. In today's episode, we'll be looking at the US occupation of Nicaragua. In 1909, Nicaraguan President Jose Santos Zelaya of the Liberal Party faced opposition from the Conservative Party led by Governor Juan Jose Estrada, who ended up receiving support from the US government. The United States had limited military presence in the nation, having only one patrolling naval ship off the coast. The Conservative Party sought to overthrow Zelaya, which led to Estrada's rebellion in December of 1909. 2 Americans were captured and indicted for allegedly joining the rebellion and laying down mines. Zelaya ordered the execution of the 2 Americans, which heavily severed US relations. Forces under Juan Estrada and various other commanders led a conservative revolt against Zelaya's government. They captured 3 small towns on the border with Costa Rica, and they were inciting open rebellion in the capital. Zelaya resigned on December the 14th of 1909 due to American pressure, and his hand-picked successor, Jose Madriz, was elected by unanimous vote of the National Assembly on the 20th. The U.S. Secretary of State Philander C. Cox stated that the United States would not resume diplomatic relations. By mid-March of 1909, the insurgency led by Estrada was seemingly collapsed, and with the apparent and unexpected strength of Madriz, the U.S. withdrew its naval forces. However, Madriz was unable to restore order, and he resigned on August the 20th of 1910, resulting in Estrada rising to power. Estrada's administration allowed US President William Howard Taft to apply the dollar diplomacy, with the stated goal to undermine European financial strength in the region and to protect American private investment in the extraction of natural resources. The policy opened the door for American banks to lend money to the Nicaraguan government, ensuring US control over the country's finances. Political differences between the 2 parties in the nation soon surfaced once again, and Minister of War General Luis Mena forced Estrada to resign. Estrada's vice president, the conservative Alfredo Diaz, then became president. Diaz's connection with the United States led to a decline in his popularity. Nationalistic sentiment arose in the military, including Luis Mena again. Mena managed to gain the support of the National Assembly, accused Diaz of selling out the nation, and called for his resignation. Diaz asked the US government for help as Mena's opposition turned into rebellion. In mid-1912, Mena persuaded the National Assembly to name him successor when Diaz's term expired. When the United States refused to recognize the Assembly's decision, Mena rebelled against the Diaz government. Diaz, relying on the US government's traditional support of the government, made clear that he would not guarantee the safety of US persons and property in Nicaragua and requested US intervention. In the first 2 weeks of August of 1912, Mena and his forces captured steamers that were owned by railroad companies that were managed by US interests. Insurgents attacked the capital, subjugating it to a 4-hour bombard. In September, 100 US Marines arrived shortly reinforced by 350 Marines, and the commander of the American forces was Admiral William Henry Hudson Sutherland. My God, what a name. Him himself joined by Colonel Joseph Henry Pendleton and 750 more Marines. The main goal was securing the railroad from Coronado to the capital. The United States kept a contingent force in Nicaragua almost continually from 1912 until 1933. Although it was reduced to 100 in 1913, the contingent served as a reminder of the willingness of the United States to use force and its desire to keep the conservative government in power. Under the United States supervision, national elections were held in 1913, but the Liberals refused to participate in the election, and Alfredo Diaz was re-elected to a full term. Foreign investment decreased during this period because of the high levels of violence and political instability. Nicaragua and the United States signed but never ratified the Castile-Knox Treaty in 1914, giving the US the right to intervene in the nation to protect US interests. A modified version, the Camaro-Bryan Treaty, omitted the intervention clause, but was finally ratified by the United States Senate in 1916. This treaty gave the US exclusive rights to build an interoceanic canal across Nicaragua. Because the US had already built the Panama Canal, the terms of the treaty served the primary purpose of securing US interests against political foreign countries, mainly that being Germany or Japan, building another canal in Central America. The treaty also transformed Nicaragua into a United States protectorate. Collaboration with the US allowed the Conservatives to remain in power until 1925. The Liberals boycotted the 1916 election, and Conservative Emiliano Camaro was elected with no opposition. The Liberals did participate in the 1920s election, but the backing of the US and a fraudulent election put Diego Manuel Camaro to the chair. The late 20s and early 30s saw the growing power of Ernesto Somoza Garcia, a leader who would create a dynasty that ruled Nicaragua for 4.5 decades. In the United States, popular opposition to the intervention rose as the casualty list grew. Anxious to withdraw from the nation's politics, the US turned over command of the National Guard to the Nicaraguan government, and the US Marines left the country soon afterward. Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 4 of the Short Banana Wars series. The Banana Wars were a series of US invasion/interventions in Latin America during the early 20th century. This series is meant to give a little insight as to what occurred during this event that in many ways have impacted the citizens of these nations until modern day. In today's episode, we'll be looking at the US occupation of Haiti. Between 1919 and 1915, Haiti was politically unstable. A series of political assassinations and forced exiles resulted in 6 different presidents holding office during this period. Various revolutionary armies carried out the coups, and they were enlisted by rival political factions under the promises of money which would be paid after a successful revolution. The United States was worried about German influence over the island nation. Haiti had around 200 Germans within its community, but these Germans held a massive amount of economic and political power. They had married into predominant Haitian families and built up a good portion of the modern transportation market as well as the ports of trade. The German Empire, in turn, had tried to exert some influence over the Caribbean since the 1880s against the wishes of the United States. Plans had been drawn up by Germany to actually attack the US at the turn of the 20th century, hint hint, click on the video I have about that subject here, but they were shelved shortly after the construction. American businesses' interests were also at odds with them, as the vast mineral and material wealth of Haiti was well known to many of the world. The Germans also served as the principal financiers of the nation's revolutions, floating loans at high interest rates to the competing political factions. Because of this, they were regarded as a threat to American financial interests. The US military leadership believed that Haitian Germans were tied directly to the government in Berlin. To counter this influence, the US sponsored a New York-run group of investors to buy out the only national bank in Haiti, which would effectively put the nation's commerce under American investor control. In December of 1914, the US military seized the Haitian government's gold reserve and transferred it to the investors' bankers, as well as slightly assist Jean-Fabre Guillaume, or just Sam, in becoming president in February the following year. Sam turned his presidency into a dictatorship 5 months later and ordered the execution of 167 political rivals, all of which were from the predominant families with German connections. Sam was killed by a mob in Port-au-Prince as soon as they learned of the executions. The United States regarded what had turned into an anti-American revolt against Sam as a threat to American business interests in the country, and sent forces to occupy the nation immediately. US President Woodrow Wilson ordered 330 US Marines to occupy Port-au-Prince on July the 25th. Wilson also aimed to rewrite the Haitian Constitution as it banned foreign ownership of land, but he wanted to replace it with one that guaranteed American financial control over the markets. As soon as US Marines landed on the island, various groups fought against them and the later established island government for years. This period is referred to as the Cacao Wars, named after the band of peasant militia that largely made up these rebellious bands. It wasn't until the last Marines left in 1934 that these skirmishes and battles finally settled. In September of 1915, the US Senate ratified the Haitian-American Convention, a treaty granting the United States security and economic oversight of Haiti for a 10-year period, and the US representatives had total veto power over the Haitian government. Within 6 weeks of the occupation, the US government seized control of Haiti's custom houses, including the banks and the national treasury. Under governmental control, a total of 40% of Haitians' national income was designated to repay debts to American and French banks, and would control Haitian external finances until 1947. Under the occupational government, civil conscription was put back into place, with a series of roads, bridges, schools, communications, and public works projects being built all around the nation. Thousands of citizens were also shipped off to work in the sugar fields in Cuba and the Dominican Republic, as the sugar crop didn't have the same export potential as the other two nations. Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 5 and the final of the short Banana Wars series. The Banana Wars were a series of US invasion/interventions in Latin America during the early 20th century. This series is meant to give a little insight as to what occurred during these events that in many ways have impacted the citizens of these nations until modern day. In today's episode, we'll be looking at the US occupation of the Dominican Republic. Following the end of the Dominican Civil War in late 1912, the nation's government still had a variety of factions that were established during the Civil War, and they worked to undermine each other for a presidency. This gridlock continued for years until 1914, when the US administration under Woodrow Wilson sent an ultimatum to the island, stating that they had to choose a legitimate president or have the US install one. A provisional president was chosen, and later the same year, relatively free elections put former President Juan Isrado Yáñez Piñera back into power. To achieve a more broadly supported government, Yáñez named opposition candidates to his cabinet, but this brought no peace. Former Secretary of War Desrado Arias aimed to depose Yáñez. Against US wishes, Yáñez agreed to resign by the end of May 1916. His resignation started the US invasion and the occupation of the Republic. The first landing took place on May the 5th of 1916, when 2 companies of Marines landed at Santo Domingo. Their goal was to offer protection to the US Legion and the US Consulate, and to occupy Fort San Gimignano. 2 days later, Yáñez resigned, with Arias taking power. US Admiral Caperton's forces occupied Santo Domingo on May the 5th. Marines took the key port cities of Puerto Plata and Montecristi on June the 1st and enforced a blockade. 2 days after the Battle of Guayanillas on July the 3rd, Marine forces moved to Arias' stronghold in Santiago de los Caballeros. However, a military counter was avoided when Arias arrived in an agreement to cease resistance. 3 days after he left the country, the rest of the occupation forces landed and took control of the country within 2 months. And on November the 29th of 1916, the United States imposed a military government under Captain Harry Shepard. Marines claimed to have restored order throughout most of the Republic, with the exception of the eastern region, but resistance continued widespread. The occupation administration, however, stated that because the country's budget was balanced and its economic growth was directed toward the US, that it was stable and working as intended. A professional military organization was established and took away the power from local elites and made soldiers more loyal to the national government. It was named the Dominican Constabulary Guard and replaced the former forces responsible for the Civil War with groups less hostile to the US occupation. Most Dominicans, however, greatly resented the loss of their sovereignty. A guerrilla movement known as Gaviaros enjoyed considerable support from the population in the east. Having knowledge of the local terrain, they fought from 1917 to 1921 against the US occupation. The fighting in the countryside ended in a stalemate, and the guerrillas agreed to a conditional surrender. After World War I, public opinion in the United States began to run against the occupation. President Warren G. Harding had campaigned against the occupation of both Haiti and the Dominican Republic. In June of 1921, U.S. representatives presented a withdrawal proposal known as the Hardy Plan, which called for Dominican ratification of all acts of the military government, approved of a loan of $2.5 million for public works and other expenses, the acceptance of the U.S. officers for the constabulary, and the holding of elections under U.S. supervision. Reaction to the plan was overwhelmingly negative by the public. Moderate Dominican leaders, however, used the plan as a basis for future negotiations that resulted in a further agreement on June the 30th of 1922, allowing for the selection of a provisional president to rule until elections could be organized. Under the supervision of High Commissioner Sumner Welles, Juan Beniste Vici Borgas assumed the provisional presidency on October the 21st of 1922. In the presidential election of March of 1924, Arias Vasquez Lahara, an American ally who cooperated with the US government, handily defeated the Alliance Party and also won a comfortable majority in both houses of Congress. With his inauguration on July the 13th, control of the republic returned to Dominican hands.